have prepared will also be visible to all of you. This should be doable. Beauty of having two screens now is that I can see all of you while I'm still looking at my presentation over here. So this is absolutely great. So thank you everyone for being here. Glad to see that so many familiar names are here, ranging all the way from first year students to, well, people who are soon to be a doctor of philosophy, actually 2 or 3 weeks from now. So given that we have this very diverse audience, I've prepared a presentation that is quite general, you would say, right? So I'm not going to get into nitpicky details or show you regression tables. I'm just going to, well, sort of explain to you what my research is about and hopefully convey to you as well what I personally find interesting or, well, inspiring about it, if I may use such grandiose words. Now, as you can tell, this presentation is called Rethinking Development Economics. And the reason for that is that, of course, this session, this next gen series for which I've been invited and very grateful for, is organized by Rethinking Economics. And this got me to thinking, what exactly does rethinking economics mean, and specifically to me? So I think this begs two questions. And the first is, what does it mean to rethink? And secondly, what is economics? Now, I think the second question might be a little bit easier to start off with. Now, if you were to Google economics and find a, well, let's say common definition, you will find something along these lines. Economics is a social science concerned with the production, distribution, and consumption of goods and services. Now, right off the bat, this already triggers me, right? Because what this kind of assumes is that, well, economics is a social science, which is good. It is something that has to do with the human experience. But apparently, economics is focused on things that have to do with the consumption of goods and services. Now, this already kind of assumes that goods and services are the main thing that makes us better off, or something that our society or the way we use our resources is all about the consumption of goods and services. And to me, this seems either, well, laughably ignorant or even malicious at best. So when I think about economics myself, I think about something a little bit different, right? Instead of just the consumption of goods and services, I think we are more ignorant, and we should be present ourselves as more agnostic when it comes to what makes something good, what makes the quality of life better, because this is ultimately what development economics is about. So it got me to thinking, how would I, well, redefine economics? And I would come up with something that puts the human experience at the center and be, while still retaining its broad scope today. So I would call it something along the lines of the study or the branch of knowledge of the nature and processes leading to prosperity and well-being of societies. So here we try to capture not only what the things are that make us better off, whatever being better off may be, but also the science of what is it to be better off. Here I question specifically that goods and services may not be the thing that make us better off. Actually, there's a lot of evidence that right now more goods and services make us worse off. So I think we should be more humble. We should present ourselves as more agnostic. And when I look at this definition, I couldn't help but notice that it has a striking similarity with something else that I once looked at. Maybe some of you who have had me as a teacher in history of economics will recognize the phrase at the bottom of your slide right now, an inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations. Sounds a lot like the study of nature, of the nature and processes leading to the prosperity and well-being of societies. These are very similar, because the bottom one is the title of the treatise by Adam Smith that led to the inception of the very science that we are now all a part of, or some of us are starting to be a part of. So what I would propose is that we think about economics more in a traditional way, in the way that even Adam Smith proposed we should think about it. So in a way, what does it mean to rethink, to me, boils down to redefining economics, or even reviving economics in the same sense that or in the same way that we used to think about economics some 250 years ago. And this is, I think, much of what inspires me to do whatever I'm doing in my doctoral research. So today I want to share with you some of the findings that I have done. I'm now, let's say, a little bit past the halfway point in my research. So I have some ambitions going forward, but I also have some results. So in the first part of this talk, I will talk a little bit about how I try to redefine and revive economics through my own research and offer not only the findings, but a perspective. And secondly, I will talk about my ambitions for the next half of my doctoral research. And I think many of you either remember me or still see me as a teacher. I am also quite used to delivering to you some bite-sized nuggets of information that you can then remember or write down somewhere, and that you reproduce exactly to exam questions that I tailor to you, so that I can distinguish whether you get a 7 or an 8 or a 9. But this is not the kind of talk that I want to have today. I'm not here to make sure that you have a particular grade or that you walk away knowing exactly how to apply the efficient market hypothesis or whatever. Now, what I try to do is to keep things as general as possible and try to share with you my, well, I would say, take on what economics is. And to give you an idea of why I started doing what I am doing right now, I would like to present to you 2 quotes. So first is a quote by some author in The Guardian a while ago. I cannot remember exactly who it was, but this person said, "You cannot win an argument unless you expound your own values and reframe the issue around them." So in other words, if you and I have a disagreement, then the best way for me to persuade you is to start using your way of looking at the world and trying to convince you of an alternative reality within your own framework. But, or in my own framework, I messed that one up. So in other words, I need to convince you that the way I'm looking at the world is better. But one of the, well, not even household names, but one of the leading figures in my field of science, Herman Daly, said the following. He said, "Using an opponent's concepts against his position is often the best and fairest way to engage in his attention." And this is something that really struck me, right? If we are thinking about reviving economics, if we are thinking about redefining economics, will we achieve that, especially as a young researcher, by simply being very anti-everything, or is it better to engage with traditional economics using their logic, using their concepts? And I opt to choose for the latter. And I think this is especially visible in my first article. I've written so far 2 articles that are under peer review at journals right now. And the first one is something that I started doing, or at least that I try to apply this quote to. So just to give a brief recap, and I really hope people are not tuning out by me showing this particular graph, but just to show you what, which machine I am raging against, so to speak. Let's consider this neoclassical model of development. This was originally developed by Solow and Swan. It's called the Solow-Swan model, and there's something very particular about this model. It says that development, us becoming richer or better off, is a process that is driven by the fact that as we accumulate more income, we save a larger part of that income and have more investments and therefore more capital at our disposal. And because each and every single worker in our economy will have more capital to work with, they will become more productive, and they will be able to create more outputs and therefore more income, which they can save and then et cetera, et cetera. So there are 2 main production factors according to this neoclassical model of production. Our prosperity is achieved using simply capital and labor. And the more capital we accumulate, the more prosperous we become. This is almost like an automatic process if you believe the curve that you see on the right-hand side. And we equate prosperity or well-being here simply with outputs per person or GDP per capita as we measure it empirically. So the main gist of this idea is the thing that we all learn in first-year macroeconomics, and that well, we still implicitly assume to be true all the way down to international economics master, is that we are living in a capital-driven economy. And regardless of which exact assumptions you use, there's one fundamental truth. And the fundamental truth is that once we accumulate more capital, we have more output growth and we are therefore better off. But we are also able to invest more, and we are able to do that through savings. And because we invest more, we have more capital accumulation, and we're in this virtuous cycle where almost automatically we become better and better off. So this seems to be the theoretical backbone that was more or less invented around the 1950s and has, well, at least withstood the test of time up until now, and is still seen as the main idea behind development. And in my first article, which is called Debunking Cross-Country Conversions, which is basically an implication of this model, the wealth of poor nations is not catching up, I ask one very simple question, and that is, can we establish empirically that outputs and capital per capita expand in tandem? In other words, according to this model, the whole idea is framed around that the more capital we have, the more output we have, and vice versa. Now, I simply ask, given that we have new data available, is this true? And this is, again, I think, a clear example of using the existing knowledge that we have and using the arguments by neoclassical economics to see whether their own arguments hold up in their own framework. And the answer might not surprise you given this talk. The answer is no. There is no association, according to my research, that the amount of capital we have per person or per worker has any connection to the rate at which output or other measures of prosperity grow. So in other words, we don't find a negative correlation, we don't find a positive correlation. We can simply state that economic development is not driven by capital stocks. The most fundamental theoretical backbone of what it is to be a neoclassical growth economist does not appear to match the data that we have since the early beginnings of this decade. Well, actually, we're in 2020 right now, so I'm talking about the previous decade. You can tell I'm getting old. Maybe I shouldn't be a next-gen economist. Anyway, I put an asterisk there because we have to take a little bit of a sidestep and ask ourselves some more fundamental questions. So what exactly do we mean by capital? What is capital? And if we think about it in the ways that you've learned in macroeconomics, and if you read about the literature or in the literature that was incepted some 60, 70 years ago, you would think as capital as the means or all the objects that are man-made that we can somehow apply to production, right? So quite literally, I am providing a service now, and this service can only be achieved through the use of my monitor, my webcam, my microphone, and all these other pieces of equipment. So these are things that make me more productive. In other words, if I hadn't had all of these, I would have to shout really, really loudly for you all to hear me, even those people who are watching this from Amsterdam. But this kind of begs the question that in today's economy, is the physical capital that is man-made all around us, is that the only thing that's relevant to production? And many of us are already aware that this is definitely not the case anymore in advanced societies. Now, instead, we also have things like human capital, which you could argue are the human objects, or, well, let's be honest, humans are also man-made, but let's not delve into a biology lesson here. The human and social capital, the things that make us humans and that connects us humans, these are also things that are important to production. So we could think about capital as being a physical stock or a capacity to provide some flows of resources into production. And of course, physical capital provides flows of, well, produced capital, you could say, or produced resources, but human provides labor, right? And social capital also provides some resources into production. And my addition to this, well, I'm not the one who originally coined this, of course, but I emphasize that we are omitting a very important capital stock, which is the natural capital stock. And we can define the natural capital stock as all the ecosystem services, so everything that nature provides us that can potentially supply resources into production. So think about a forest. A forest is part of our natural capital stock, and it supplies things like timber into production that we use to build houses in, in the US, right? That's why they burn so easily. We have subsoil assets like minerals and ores that we use to create many of these products. We have pasture land and all these other natural processes that occur that we can use and extract for goods and services, but also for direct enjoyment. But there's something very peculiar about natural capital, because natural capital is, according to these definitions, very much a form of capital, right? It's an indispensable flow of resources that without it, we will be unable to produce new things. But it is different because once we have used natural resources, they become physically embodied into products. So they depreciate upon use. In other words, in order to make this guitar, I have to extract some iron that is being made into these strings, and that iron cannot be used another time. But the labor that has gone into this guitar, or bass guitar more specifically, has not gone in there physically. There's no thumb of some poor guy in Mexico who managed to make this guitar, right? So the use of natural resources come at a cost, regardless of whether they're exhaustible or replenishable. So what is the connection between all of these different types of capital forms and development? Why did I make this elaborate sidestep to talking about what is capital? Well, I said before that the size of our capital stock does not appear to be of any relevance to development. But what it does show is that the composition of our capital stock is a very strong predictor of development. In other words, the man-made capital, the physical products, the buildings, the infrastructure, and everything that we associate with the Solow model actually does not appear to have any connection to the rate of development. But instead, what we do find is that the more human capital a country has, the more it develops. And the less natural capital it has, the more slowly it develops, right? The more, so the quicker it develops. So if you look at a particular country, let's say, even if you're an underdeveloped country, but you have a small amount of natural capital, but you are accumulating human capital quite rapidly, then it seems to be that you're quite rapidly developing, and you will do so over time. But there are some countries apparently that have little human capital and a lot of natural capital, and they seem to suffer most. So this begs the question, and this should beg the question, I think, does natural capital depletion therefore hinder sustainable development? Is it that countries that are endowed with a lot of natural capital therefore suffer because they have these material resources or these natural resources compared to having man-made or human resources? And this is my second article, of course. Now, in this second article, I find something that you might find counterintuitive. I won't go into the exact empirical or methodological stuff that goes into the article. If you're interested, you can always send me an email. But it shows that if we utilize natural capital in production, in other words, if we extract the iron and the forest and we use the land for agricultural production, we seem to be much better off over time. In other words, we appear to be making a successful conversion of natural capital into other forms of production that make us prosperous. Now, this holds true both for those countries that appear to suffer from the resource curse, right? The countries that have a lot of natural capital also make this positive conversion, and other developing economies. But perhaps quite paradoxically, the only countries that seem to struggle to convert their natural capital sufficiently into, well, predominantly human capital are the countries that are already developed. Think of the Netherlands, think of Australia, think of the United States, etc. Now, how come that the developed economies, with all their technology, with all their knowledge, and with, let's say, their head start in development, why are they the ones that have most difficulty using natural capital in, well, a sustainable way? I think this paradox can be solved by thinking about diminishing returns. If you assume that there are diminishing returns to human capital, in other words, if it is more difficult to educate somebody from, let's say, a high school level to a university level, or more easy than it is to educate somebody from a first PhD to a second PhD, then it makes a lot of sense, right? We are already very educated. We are already quite healthy. Our ability to provide useful work into economic processes is near what is at this point technologically possible. So it's much, if we cut down a tree, it's much more difficult to convert that into more health or more education, whereas the gains to be had in developing countries are much larger. So these are just the simple findings that I have extracted from these two articles. There's more in there, but I just want to keep it focused. And I would like to offer you now a perspective. What can we learn from all of this? And I think we can extract three simple lessons. Is that in contrast to what neoclassical economics tries to teach you, capital actually plays a different role at different stages of development. And that goes for each type of capital. So for pure simplicity, don't read too much into these graphs. I've illustrated the three graphs of the three types of capital that I looked at. At the top, you see HC, human capital, in the middle, natural capital, NC, and at the bottom, PC. Now, human capital seems to have some diminishing returns, right? That's why we have a upward sloping connection between, let's say, the W for well-being and human capital. So it's increasing, but at a diminishing rate. In natural capital, we seem to be able to be better off the more we deplete it, right? So our well-being goes up the less natural capital we have, let's say going from 0.1 to 0.2. And produced capital does not seem to matter at all, or hardly at all. There seems to be a very brief phase in development where the amount of produced capital you have contributes to being better off, but at a decreasing rate. So actually, I didn't illustrate this properly. It should be a curve, but the idea is it's a nonlinear relationship. So how can we tie all of this together? Well, if we abstract from this, you could say that our well-being on the y-axis over time, the x-axis, is very nonlinear. From the beginning, we seem to be struggling to become wealthier when we may even become less wealthy or less prosperous over time, seeing as an initial decrease in our well-being over time. But as soon as we start accumulating human capital rapidly, and for a brief phase, produced capital as well, our well-being, our prosperity seems to skyrocket. And this is just simply let's say an abstraction from the snapshot of development that I looked at over the past couple of decades. And this seems to fit the mold of development quite well. So in this case, natural capital depreciation, which we may think of for various reasons as being unsustainable, you could also look at from an economic perspective and say that it is simply a symptom of development. Most countries need to depreciate the natural capital only temporarily in order to get to use as a springboard for accumulating human capital. And then human capital at some point takes over and is likely a strong driver of development for a larger part of the development cycle. And produced capital is largely non-linear and only very temporarily relevant. And then you get this camel-shaped, hump-shaped, S-shaped, U-shaped. I didn't know what to call this particular graph. Maybe it's a wave. Please, if you have any suggestions, email it to me and let me know. But the main gist is that when we use these broader definitions of capital that more closely align with what we think of being the economy today, it actually matches real world observations a lot better, right? This matches what we observe in the real world, whereas it doesn't match what neoclassical economics predicts. So here I think that with two very straightforward articles, we can show that it is very much necessary to use a more comprehensive definition of, well, wealth and economics. But I would warn you to not think that there is a one-size-fits-all mode of development, because, well, capital composition, the things that I just talked about, whether you have a lot of natural capital, human capital, and when produced capital starts kicking in, I think that's only indicative of the process of development. I think it is something that we observe that as a result of development. It is not a fundamental cause of development, right? So I'm very much aware that I have not explained anything so far. I have only mapped things. And the way that I try to think about it is to picture that every country has let's say, a version of this universal timeline of development. If I think what stages countries have gone through, I personally think that there are 3 stages that countries have gone through or are going through. There is a moment of general scarcity, somewhere where we have not been very prosperous, right? For the Netherlands, this has been several hundred years ago. For some sub-Saharan African countries, general scarcity is still going on today. We haven't usually seen rapid accumulations of human capital. Then for some reason, we switch to rapid development. And notice that I say for some reason, because again, we haven't explained anything yet. And in this development, we see perhaps that produced capital may become a little bit more important, but mostly that processes are jump-started to boost to a level of sustained affluence, where we see that a couple of countries are, let's say, for now, indefinitely prosperous. And I think what we need to do in development economics, what we need to do in economics in general, is to try to explain why these processes are there and why they are prolonged in some countries, why these processes may take one country from general scarcity to rapid development, etc. And let me give you an example of what I think it might actually look like. So consider here a country that is still to today in general scarcity, right? This is generally not a wealthy country, doesn't have a lot of human capital. Sure, it may generate more income over time, but as one of my, as my first paper shows, income and well-being are, in today's terms, not linked anymore, right? In almost all measures of well-being are not connected to the amount of income per capita that we see anymore. So how can we explain whether this country is becoming more prosperous? Well, initially it has been endowed with particular traits, right? It has geographical and ecological properties. Let's say if it's landlocked or if it's at a harbor, if it's closer to the equator or not, whether it has a lot of natural resources and which one it has, which also seems to be important. And this has happened hundreds or maybe thousands of years ago. Now, in today's world, this country may not be functioning according to the perfect democratic lines. You could say there's a lot of political turmoil, maybe a lot of coups happening, etc. And then there are things that are happening overseas or internationally, such as globalization or the information revolution. It says information, but it's supposed to be information revolution. Now, if you're an underdeveloped country, then globalization may not be as advantageous for you as, let's say, standard trade theory predicts. This is what I will get to later. So whereas globalization may benefit us as being a very affluent nation, it may actually harm others. In the same way, the information revolution may very much benefit us as the developed world, but this underdeveloped nation will likely have a harder time shifting towards a rapid development phase. And actually, if we put some labels on this particular example, I can see that this fits the mold of Nigeria quite well. It has a huge amount of natural resources that have been quite abundant, that have been created 200+ million years ago. I looked it up, that's how long it takes to make coal. And in 1966, a lot of political turmoil has happened. And of course, this is not a one-time thing. This has persisted throughout time. Since the 1980s, where you could argue that there has been a rapid increase in globalization, meaning that now one of the things that has happened is that China has come in and used the political landscape to extract these natural resources and therefore locking them into what we call a resource curse. And the information revolution has not been anything that they could use to jumpstart their development. So what do we learn from this? Well, that a lot of these processes, a lot of these mechanics that underlie development, well, they may not be idiosyncratic, right? One thing may happen to one country that doesn't happen to another. For instance, political turmoil in Nigeria has not affected my country personally. And some of these things may happen at the same time, but at different stages of development. So globalization has happened more or less at the same time for everyone, or the information revolution, but it affects us way differently because we're already affluent and others like Nigeria aren't. So in other words, economic development is messy. Even though we may have this mold of this particular curve that I found, it may only apply to this specific time period that I looked at. And what we should be interested in as economists, I think, is understanding why there is no linear growth and understanding why development may not necessarily be this S or U-shaped or W-shaped that we saw. Now, I think we should focus more on the complex interactions between social, geographical, political, historical, and technological factors, right? We see that these arrows that are underneath each individualized timeline are the things that explain development. And what we have done, and admittedly what I have done so far, is simply look at the outcomes of development. We are not understanding the processes and nature of our well-being. We are simply running behind the facts so far. So in other words, where does my knowledge break down? And I think this is already should be quite apparent from what I've talked about so far. Where does my knowledge break down? Where does the knowledge break down of my fellow economists? Well, one of the paradoxes from the findings that I had earlier is that development seems to be slower in economies who have more natural capital, right? Having all else equal. But that natural capital also provides this window of opportunity for development that apparently even the countries that are suffering from having natural capital seem to be converting them efficiently into other types of prosperity. Now, why is that the case? Isn't this kind of like a paradox? So if natural capital can be extracted and is extracted successfully, then why do some countries seem to suffer if they have so much natural capital? And I think the example I gave earlier about China coming into Nigeria, extracting resources, might give us a sign of what it is. Because my hunch is, my gut feeling is that modern international trade may not be as advantageous as, let's say, comparative advantage and the standard intra-industry trade mallet model may predict. But instead, maybe it is the case that modern international resource trade in particular creates some process that harms these countries, that in the meantime shows that taking natural capital out of the ground may be a good thing, but what happens next may be a bad thing. So there's this theory called the theory of unequal exchange, which boiled down to the core is basically the idea that when there is trade between two countries, one being a core country, core being, let's say, a rich country, a country that takes center stage in the global economy, say, West Europe or Europe generally, the United States, Australia, etc. These are countries that engage in a lot of resource trade with underdeveloped countries, countries that are in the periphery of the global economy. This is what we call core periphery trade. And the assumption is that this happens under asymmetric power relations, right? Instead of there being comparative advantages, we as core countries may be able to extract more gains from this trade than would be theoretically possible. And these peripheral nations, on the other hand, they are unable to obtain the theoretical gains. They are somehow suffering from engaging in resource trade with us, the developed nations. Now, the main idea is, and I will leave the exact theoretical specification of this hypothesis to the curious reader, is that developing economies then sort of double down in their resource sectors, right? They become very much, they try to become as efficient and as productive in the natural resource sector, meaning also that because they are becoming so productive there, they are able to convert the natural resources quite efficiently into other resources, but they are sort of locking into the specialization trap. In other words, what you would expect to see is to go from general scarcity to rapid development by moving away from natural capital. And because we are using our political weight to extort them into going into the natural capital sector because we need their resources, they are now locked into a situation where they are not benefiting in the long run. Now, this is roughly called the environmental Prebisch hypothesis. If you are interested in, look it up. And the main idea is that these countries fall into the specialization trap. So you could say the hypothesis is that relying on natural capital may trigger processes that stifle development, that even though you have some gains in the short run, in the long run, it will hold you in this, let's say, general scarcity phase of development. And I have done some back of the envelope theoretical or empirical calculations for this. I have some results, but I haven't done the robustness checks yet, so I'm hesitant to show them to you yet. But what it does show is that if you have unequal exchange between core and periphery countries, this is a significant factor that holds back development. And in other words, you do see that at the same time, while these developing countries are able to use the potential of their natural resources, their entire structure of their economy, let's say the underlying processes that should lead them to development, are stifled at the same time. So developing economies with more natural capital benefit from their natural capital, but at the same time, they suffer more. So there's quite some complex interactions going on there. But one thing we have to be careful of, especially in modern day empirical economic research, is that we don't equate correlation with causation, right? All the empirical methods that we tend to use, the simple OLSs, fixed effects, and you name it, are usually geared towards showing correlations, and then by assumption, we try to infer causation. But I think a more general question is, if there is this tension between human capital and natural capital, if there's this tension between natural resources and development, can we somehow use an experiment to show a causal relation between the two? Now, this is, I think, my most ambitious and also my least developed project to this point. In this project, I tried to find a case where likely I'm going to use a particular case study in Indonesia to further our understanding of the causal relations between natural capital and development. Specifically, what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at Indonesian districts who have, in the span of 1 year, gained full autonomy over their natural resources, where some districts are very well endowed with natural resources and others aren't. So we can track what happens on a very let's say, small scale, whether these natural resources are being converted efficiently into human capital. So here, what I try to do is to see whether this tension between human and natural capital accumulation can also be found at the very micro level. We can see what companies are engaging in this, what regional Indonesian districts are doing this. So we are trying to find, let's say, individual behaviors that may explain this emergent macroeconomic phenomenon. Now, again, this one is still in development, so I'm hesitant to show you the exact research outline, but if you are ever interested, please let me know. Now, I think we should start to wrap up, so I would like to present to you some final thoughts. And one thing that that always strikes me is to try to think the following phrase: much of what we think we know just ain't so. Like, the things that we assume to be true may not be true. And I think this is generally a good approach to conducting sound science. So I think this has led to a couple of insights: that natural capital plays an important role, or maybe even a more important role in each nation's timeline. we may think that, let's say, Britain or the Netherlands has not benefited a lot from natural capital, but what has been shown is that our colonial past and our ability to industrialize has only been made possible through the natural resources that we have extracted elsewhere. So thanks, Indonesia. And the way we use natural resources may differ per time, per place, and location. Again, this is alluding to the idea that every country has an individualized timeline. But I would also warn that many of the things that I do, you may need to look at critically, right? Everything that I do, I try to question, is this sound science? Am I not making a bold assumption? Is something that I'm doing incorrect, or is the data that I'm using reliable? I think, and I would really encourage you to always be critical, not only of other people or your opponents, but especially to yourself, because that's how you develop a better knowledge base. And I would like to encourage you to think about development not as capital accumulation or any of the other things that you learn typically in macroeconomics, but to see development as a part of the social sciences. It is shaped by political environments. It is shaped by our institutions, by things that happened historically or even geographically historically millions of years ago. All these things interact in a very messy way. We are locking into path-dependent processes. This may be circular, these may be asynchronous, or even quasi-random. Development is unpredictable, but I think we can do a much better job at understanding it if we simply present ourselves as being agnostic towards development and assume that we do not know as much as we think we know, because much of what we think we know just ain't so. And I would like to thank you very much for your attention so far.
Wow, thank you so much, Charan, for this amazing talk. Okay, we already have questions. We have one from Daniel, and I'll read it out for you. Thank you, Charan. I have a long question. You mentioned that economic development is messy and illustrate how, for instance, institutional issues moderate the effects of human capital, natural capital. Is it possible to conceptualize or even measure the effects of institutional strength in a similar manner to human capital and natural capital, and perhaps connected to the Lipset versus Acemoglu debate?
I think it's, I think here you have to really delve into what it is, what natural capital is, what institutions are, and what social capital is, right? Because I think much of what we think is institutions, others will call social capital, and much of what social capital is, we would sometimes, let's say, operationalize empirically as being human capital. For instance, there's one paper that came out yesterday that has a lot to do with my third article that talks about human capital as being the percentage of Christians in a developing economy, which is not human capital, right? But there is a very elaborate line of reasoning that kind of makes you want to assume that is still the case. I would like to encourage everyone at least to be very cautious in making these separations, right? So if you're saying, well, how is it possible to operationalize institutional or institutions is a part of your question, I believe. What exactly are institutions? And I think, Daniel, you asked the question. Right? Could you perhaps elaborate what according to you institutions are?
Well, yeah, of course. But the broader idea here is that if you, I hope it's okay to respond, by the way.
Yes.
But
yes, of course.
Okay, thank you. So the broader idea is that if you look at anything, right, you can always go into more detail and say, well, okay, not all physical capital is made equal or has the same effects. The same is true for human capital, and still we model it that way because it is a useful way to look at this. My idea when I was looking, especially slide 11, is that right now you use institutions in a particular way. So for instance, well, look, the trajectory, the effects of this human capital, natural capital, produced capital, is not always the same because of the context it happens in. And then you come up with some institutional, I would say that as institutional to answer your question, for instance, the political turmoil part, as an excuse for why a model breaks down. That's almost like an excuse, right? My invitation would be to try to think of institutional strength, maybe abstract it a little bit in the same way that you do human capital. So try to match it onto those curves, because I think that if you do that, you can actually, maybe you don't want to because it makes it a little bit broad, but you could contribute to longer debates by, for instance, Acemoglu on whether or not wealth or economic growth drives institutional change, or whether institutional change drives growth.
Yes.
So I think it's just, institutions matter, I would say. You would say that as well, I think. And my comment is just try to map what the impact of institutional strength is on this development trajectory that countries can have.
Yes,
So,
I completely agree with you to the extent that this is exactly what I have done indeed in the first paper. So where I talk about to what extent do these capital stocks influence our rate of development, you have to somehow account for the fact that institutions affect development, like the different kinds of institutions as well, right? So we have the political institutions that you see right now, as well as the geographical institutions. Now, there are different ways of measuring this, right? You can look at whatever we can observe today and use the typical, let's say, world governance indicators or polity databases, and etc. Or you can use what my colleagues like to refer to as the deep determinants. So the things that has happened thousands, if not thousands of years ago, if not longer, that can explain why institutions are the way they are today. And accounting for all of these factors, then the story about the capital stock emerges. That's the background of this. That's the background of what I've done today. And if your idea is try to come up with, or try to account for the fact that institutions are not all the same and they may have interactions with different capital stocks differently at different times, if that is what you are saying, and you are welcome to respond again, then I totally agree with you.
Yeah, I won't go into too much detail because I don't. Can you hear me, by the way? Okay,
yes.
Yeah, now it's lighting up. It wasn't lighting up. So, but yeah, maybe it's also a good idea to maybe talk about this another time to open up the floor to the rest. But yeah, I mean, you have a good point, but I would just say try to be a bit more formal about how you include institutions. Maybe it's just an idea. It was very interesting talk, so thank you.
Thank you, Daniel, for the question. Willem, would you like to go with your question?
Yes,
please
thank you,
unmute yourself.
Constantina. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Charan, first of all, thank you for your really interesting talk. Yeah, you started out with the Solow model, in which we look at the level of investment needed to offset the depreciation to either increase or sustain the output level. And I think we could also look at the inputs of natural capital to sustain or to offset the depreciation, because if you need new machines, you also need more natural capital to build these.
Unless
And
you recycle.
What's that?
Unless you recycle.
Unless we recycle, yeah. But my question is, do you think we can absolutely decouple economic growth from the use of natural capital in the long term?
That's a very good question. Just to make sure that that you're asking the same question that I'm answering, what do you mean by economic growth?
So do you think we can increase the capital level without the use of natural resources in the long term? Because in the future it will become harder to extract natural capital as it runs out. So do you think, like, in the long term, we still will be able to offset depreciation by new investments without using natural capital, for example, and we'll be able to recycle or grow to more of an information economy that needs less resources?
There's a lot to unpack there, but I think it's a very fundamental question that that you're asking. To what extent will we always have to rely on extracting new natural resources to become more prosperous. And I will not pretend that I have a perfect answer to this question, because it's perhaps one of the biggest open questions in ecological economics, which just goes to show how good your question is. So to get to the point, I think that we can't right now completely stop extracting natural capital or natural resources. I don't think we have the production technologies to sustain the way we conduct ourselves in today's society fully through recycling. I think that some of our production processes are not built so that we can reuse old materials that went into the products perfectly into a new product or into a new piece of produced capital. So either we would have to scale down our production, which even if you abstract away from the idea that we always want more production, right? I think if we scale down production, we would have to make concessions. I would propose we stop making iPhones, but hey, I think that's not a politically feasible way of going forward. But generally, yes, I think we can do a lot more to use less natural resources, a lot more. Can we decouple completely? Not yet. I would say that that is perhaps one of the main aims we should have as a global society, instead of just trying to alleviate poverty and stuff. We should maybe perhaps think about how can we alleviate poverty by redistributing our current wealth, and instead of relying on natural resource extraction to alleviate poverty. And then in the very, very long run, we can start thinking about how we can expand our natural resource stock by, let's say, asteroid mining. But then I'm talking about way, way into the future. I hope that answers your question, Willem.
Yes, interesting stuff. Thank you, Charan.
Thank you for your question, Willem. There's one last question from the participants. That's from Leon, and he asks, doesn't well-being amount to capital accumulation in the end, considering that most of our material wealth originates from imported foreign natural capital?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question, or can I see it in the chat somewhere?
You can, yes.
Yeah. Doesn't well-being amount to capital accumulation in the end? So you're equating well-being to capital accumulation, or are you equating well-being to the size of the capital stock? Because accumulation is, of course, a first derivative.
Yeah, when I formulated the question, I didn't even consider that that precisely, but yeah, you're right. I was actually talking about the first derivative. Yeah.
So you're saying the more capital we have, the more prosperous we become, or the more capital we have, we need to keep accumulating capital to remain at the same level of prosperity?
No, I mean, what I was thinking about is that you build up this connection between having natural capital and the downward sloping curve.
Yes.
Where was it like that well-being deteriorates with an increase in natural capital, right?
Yes.
Yeah. And I was thinking about first of all, being a reverse causality, and thinking about that it's not necessarily who has the natural capital in his sort of ground, but like rather who takes it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I understand what you're saying, but I would caution you not to read too much into that graph, right? Because kind of what it appears to imply is that the less natural capital we have, the better off we are. But I think what the only thing it illustrates is that the less natural capital we have, the bigger the value of other capital stocks become in a more than proportional way. In other words, we make a net gain. But from a very personal experience, I would be the first to argue that there's more inherent value to natural capital than the data that I use implies. In other words, I live here in Nijmegen, and right next to our university, we have a beautiful forest called Humus Oord. Now, potentially we could cut this forest down, sell the materials and use this to educate the poorest of the poorest people in Africa. And I'm pretty sure that on a global scale, we will make a gain according to this indicator. But I would caution you not to think that the more capital we have, the better off we are, because your question refers to well-being, right? I think that at some point, and we may already be beyond that point, the extraction of natural capital becomes more costly, or may harm our well-being more than even the most up-to-date data that I use implies. I would be very cautious in saying that natural capital may actually improve our well-being.
Okay, I do understand that, but I meant it in a way of looking at where we are right now, like all the wealth we have. It mainly originates from importing foreign natural capital. That's what
You mean in developed economies, or in the Netherlands specifically?
In developed economies in general. Also, like, for example, I live in Germany, and we benefit from the import of basically products that were built out of natural capital from different countries. So basically, like, we take it from other countries and import it into our country, and therefore we basically or indirectly accumulate this kind of capital.
Yes. And indirectly, we are decumulating it in the place where we are getting it from.
Exactly, yeah.
Yes, so in the end, how much does well-being take place? Well, I think we're kind of reverse Robin Hooding the situation. Well, actually, I think that's primarily what the third article implies, the way I've shown it right now. And is there a way to say reverse Robin Hooding? Anyway, I think it's very, I think it's bad practice, and I don't think I think we need to reconsider doing it. But I think overall, we're not improving well-being, we're just transferring it, but asymmetrically in the wrong direction. Does that allude to the question that you were asking?
Yes, yeah, basically, yeah.
Okay, thank you, Leon. There is one last question from Bradley, and then we'll have to wrap up the session. Bradley asks, you mentioned that developing economies usually double down and specialize in the utilization of their natural capital. To what extent may it also be a problem that the commodities they specialize in captures a small part of the value chain?
Well, we are not talking specifically about developing economies. We are talking about the developing economies that are abundant in natural capital, right? So you can clearly make a distinction between the two. But I understand that your question is about the natural resource developing economies. To what extent may it be a problem that the commodities they specialize in captures a small part of the value chain? I think we're talking about the same thing here. You can ask yourself the question, why is it only a small part of the value chain? I think a large reason for that is that there are many external costs associated with natural capital that are not included in the value chain. That's what makes it profitable to extract them, because they're so darn cheap, whereas they should have been more expensive if you consider what we call externalities, right? So I think we're talking about two sides of the same medallion here.
Okay, I think that concludes the questions from participants. I would just like to conclude the session by asking my own question, because I'm very curious. You have given us a great presentation, and a lot of the things you said actually fly in the face of a lot of knowledge that we gain in macroeconomics. And I'm just very curious. It's quite stunning that your empirical findings find that there's basically no relation between capital stocks and output growth. How do you, how much is this accepted in your academic environment between your colleagues? And how do you feel about that yourself as a researcher?
So far I have presented this only at a very very few places. So I'm very happy to see that my promoter and supervisor support this, because otherwise my life would have been a living hell. Right now, it's a normal hell, you could say. Kidding aside, it has been received well. I did this presentation at a research day among different social sciences, and actually an ecologist came up to me after the presentation and he said, so the economists are finally catching up, aren't they? So it goes to show, I think, that it's that is moving towards a reunification of various social and geographical sciences, I guess. I have met some criticism, and that has to do with traditional economists not accepting the indicators that I use in my research. They're saying, how can you calculate natural capital, or how can you put a number on human capital, which are fair questions, right? Be very critical of everything. So especially also on the data that I use. And I think the proper response here is, it is not perfect. It is better than we had before, but it's in development. But I always make the comparison to about 100 years ago, when the measure of GDP was being constructed. And there were fierce debates on whether you could measure it and what it is supposed to measure, right? And these are very similar debates. What is natural capital? What should we include in it? How should we calculate it? And right now, we kind of accept GDP as being measuring exactly the income of a specific geographical area over a year. And I'm convinced that the more effort and attention we put into using these indicators will also result into mainstreaming them for economics as a science. And hopefully, this is also how I end in one of these papers, is I'm saying I'm trying to mainstream these indicators, but I really hope that in the, well, maybe near, but maybe distant future, we can look back at this paper and think, okay, yeah, it's glaringly obvious from the results of this paper, or how this indicator needed to be developed. So I think criticism is very much welcome. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Daniel says it's probably more accepted when you move from the management side to the geography side of the building. Okay, so unfortunately we can't address Noah's question because we're a bit over time. But I'm sure, Charan, you would be happy to answer the question if Noah sends you an email directly about this.
Sure, definitely.
Okay. So thank you so much for this presentation. It's been an amazing beginning to this webinar series. I would just like to tell everyone, if you want to keep up with our events, you can go to rethinkingeconomics.nl/Nijmegen. We also have a book club going on. And also, as I mentioned in the beginning, this meeting is recorded, and we will put Charan's presentation on the Rethinking Economics YouTube channel, and we will send you the link to everyone who has participated so you can access it and see it again. So thank you, Charan, again. Thank you, everyone who joined us, and have a nice afternoon.
Thank you, everyone.